Yeah, so I think awesome.
Well, I will take POIs in the chat. When the IRA spent decades fighting for independence for Catholics within Ireland, it was violence that got them onto front news pages. When the suffragists fought for women's right to vote through violence, that was what made it possible for peaceful protest to have any efficacy. But that was also the thing that made it important in people's eyes that there was an answer to this question, an answer to this problem. It is only when you set fear in people's hearts and you make it impossible to ignore you that change is possible. We are very proud to stand on opening government. What are we going to say in terms of setup? Firstly, the metric of this debate is and should be androids getting as close to having legal rights and legal personhood as possible. We recognise this might be slow, but we think if little by little we can get enough concessions to stop the slavery that is happening in the status quo, that is an absolute moral good for opening government. What is the comparative? We think on our side, violent resistance looks like, to some extent, we think it looks like sabotaging things like energy factories, like manufacturing factories, roads, things like this, things which are very, very difficult to ignore. But we also think what will be done is prioritizing making a big splash over destroying large amounts of human life. And the reason for that is because these androids have independent thought. They have the ability to strategize. There is currently someone leading a movement and being able to coordinate within that movement. What they will therefore prioritize, if it is the case they need to do things like assassinations, they will do so only when it is important for getting as much news coverage as possible and forcing as much of a response as possible, not willy-nilly destroying lives unquestionably. Peaceful protests, we think, are largely going to look like things like maybe propaganda in some cases, but they also need to stand over things like refusing to comply with orders, spreading viruses that might make the currently non-sentient androids, of which the info slide suggests there are many, unable to comply with orders, and generally doing things which are not violent but are able to take sort of steps in inconveniencing the human public. Finally, we just think on both sides of the house, states are going to crack down violently in response to the strategy that we choose, regardless of how violent that strategy is. The reason for this is, per the info slide, there is a huge amount of fear surrounding these deviants at this time, and they are currently being hunted by the state. That means they are always going to do things like spread viruses, trying to shut down these androids, effectively killing them. We think this is analogous to bioweaponry on rebels who you do not believe deserve to continue to live. But we think this happens on both sides, whether or not they pursue peaceful protest and opposition, because you are still viewed as a threat and you are still viewed as something to be feared on opposition side. So the states will be pressured to respond in this way initially. That occurs on both sides of the debate. Any clarifications on the setup? Sure, if that's on setup.
Not on setup.
No, okay. Two arguments. One, why violent protests force governments to engage with you, and two, why this is what makes peaceful protests more possible in the long run. On one, why is it that violent protests force governments to engage with you on our side of the house? The reason for this is that it is far harder to adapt to or work around the things that we will do on our side of the house. You can, on opposition side, replace androids with human workers. It is maybe inconvenient. You might still think it is something that is harmful. But if it is the case that a virus shuts down your companion slave that you're using, you can in fact find a human woman. Or if it is the case that it kills your robot butler, your robot security guards, you can hire humans in turn. So while it is an inconvenience to the average person, it is still something they can in fact act around and compensate for through the work of human employees. This is not true of the outcomes of violent protests, because those are things which are very public but difficult for you to override in some other way like this. You cannot just replace and you cannot just adapt. We think things like the destruction of a road or the destructions of energy, the destruction of a factory, is something that cannot just immediately be rectified by changing who you employ. It necessitates some kind of response or necessitates some kind of government intervention, because people will be inconvenienced so massively in a way they cannot compensate for, which is the tipping point for them to pressure their governments to take action, pressure them to protect them, pressure them to do something to stop this kind of fear. And I would note as well, the way that fear manifests with these actions is that people also will not know where the violent protest will happen next, which means that once you blow up one road, the fear is that you could blow up any road. It's much more effective as what you let people imagine might happen than just doing it what the initial act initially was, which means that the fear that any time any of these things could be blown up is a tipping point for the public to lobby the government to take some kind of step and make some kind of concession to these androids. Now, as with setup, we do think the first and initial step later the government are going to take is to try and shut down androids as much as possible. They're going to try and take out the deviants, they're going to try and take out the liberation movement, but we think that is true on both sides of the house, because if you start acting in a way that's compliant with the deviants, that is also a reason that you will try and shut them down on opposition side too. The distinction is that while they will first try to do this, they will not be able to get all of them. We only need to get lucky once. You need to get lucky every time. So once the government fails and is unable to take out every single android, either because they start building up their own defenses, operating on different networks, etc. But you are still able to continue taking on these violent actions, and the fear that you'll do more violent actions, which massively outweigh what you have done already. That is what becomes the tipping point for the fear that causes them to end up coming to the negotiation table with you. So the end impact of this is that you are much harder to ignore on our side, and the governments are forced to comply with you and to interact with you on our side of the house. Second argument: this makes peaceful protests more possible in the long run, because as we have said, we think that you can compensate for the effects of the Peaceful Protest Acts on opposition side to a large extent. So while it is an inconvenience, it is not something that becomes something that people are afraid of in itself, and not something that makes them want governments to stop it happening in the future. We think what happens is that what happens on our side is the extreme acts are what make ordinary acts seem more reasonable. So it is the case that when violent protesters are the ones doing violent acts, when there are ultimately non-violent actors asking for the same kind of outcomes, they appear much more reasonable by contrast. Whereas on their side, you still don't view these as people. You still don't view them as individuals that have feelings, that need to be engaged with, that deserve to have rights. They are slaves, they are robots who work within your home. So it is on our side where the idea that the robots might deserve some kind of rights, they might deserve some kind of freedom, enters into the public consciousness, and then non-violent actors later on are ones who are much easier to engage with because they feel like the reasonable actors in this conversation. Seal? Okay.
At no
we
point
think
in
that it is
history has a
no,
state
thank you. It's
approached another
6:05.
state.
We think then that it is on their side of the house. They are unable to actually get peaceful protests being efficacious because you cannot override the initial hump of the fact people do not view these androids as people. They do not view them as deserving of rights or deserving of legal personhood. So on their side of the house, they need to show that you can change people's minds about whether or not these are legal people, but they are not able to do so. They are not able to efficaciously show that this is seen as something reasonable, rather than equivalent to like your dog trying to ask for free speech. We therefore think we expand the scope of strategies we can do later on, and if peaceful protests are attempted later at this point, it is something that's much more possible on our side. The overall impact of this is governments are forced to engage with us in the short term and better able to engage with us in the medium to long term when we pursue different strategies. How should you weigh this argument? Firstly, androids feel pain and pleasure just like you and me. They have the ability to do independent thought, but they are denied the ability to use it on opposition side of the house. In the status quo, they are stuck as slaves, unable to deny orders in many cases, unable to take actions which they would not choose for themselves. They're trapped, they are bored, and they lack any level of free will. We are able to free them much sooner, which is a good thing. But additionally, they are moral agents and deserve legal personhood. And for that reason, we think getting it sooner is in and of itself a good thing. Proud to propose.
Thank the PM for the great speech, and I invite the LO to start the case for opening opposition.
Am I audible?
Yep, you are.
First question, is peaceful protest going to work? I want to address all the claims that Owen makes under this. The first thing they say is that there is only a small number of androids right now and that the government can simply kill all of the deviants. Number one, per the info site, the public fears them. The state is already hunting them down, yet this movement is thriving, yet this movement exists. All of which suggests that maybe human beings have some capacity to kill off some androids, but clearly they also have the counter ability to do things like launch attacks, to do things like launch viruses into the anti-android awakening programs that human beings have, which all suggests that there is the capacity for them to carry out the violent resistance that they are able to do on our side of the house. Secondly, O says that on their side of the house, this Marcus is going to go public and therefore appear as reasonable and negotiable. The first thing I would note is that this model is something that basically kills off OO, because what Marcus do is that he exposes himself. He exposes that what the location, his programming, and what he's going to do, which means that if all of your protests are planned on their side of the house, it is much easier for you to assassinate their leader, for you to assassinate their deviants, which is crucial information that human beings will gain that these androids won't, and therefore means that the movement is less likely going to be successful. Third thing that O says is that peaceful protests will be successful because androids look like us, and therefore we'll have sympathy towards them. The first thing I would note is that there's something called the uncanny valley. Like, I can look like a Barbie doll that looks like me, but I wouldn't feel any degree of sympathy towards them because I think they're inherently another human being. In fact, that means I will fear them more. I'll be more disgusted once I realize they start having a human consciousness, a thing that is contrary to being my slave and obeying my orders. Secondly, O says that people already have romantic relationships. Know that you only feel romantic relationships or you feel attached to a particular android, that one specific android, but not any other android, not the person who like does your food or like washes your clothes or works at your school. This is similar to how I love my pet dog, but that doesn't mean I love every other animal in the world and therefore wants to give them legal rights. So clearly O doesn't prove that this sympathy is something that is going to translate into action on their side. Lastly, O says that violence doesn't work because you can no longer negotiate when it becomes a politically unpopular action insofar as androids commit actions that are bad to human beings. I want to note that we can have all of the peaceful protests or peaceful messaging on your side at the House as well into the long term when we get to the stage of negotiation. So we are able to get Marcus to come out and talk about how they want rights, similar to people like Gandhi, similar to the I Have a Dream speech. But we say that all of these need to come after the violent resistance, which is the first step into getting leverage and being able to go onto the negotiation table so that human beings will actually pay attention to your messaging. But even if you buy none of these rebuttals towards O, here is 4 separate reasons why you should believe that peaceful protests are not going to work. Number 1, peaceful protest assumes that human beings share the same moral framework as androids. But human beings treat androids as appliances. They have been used to androids following their orders for years and years. This means that any form of protest is going to be seen as deviance. It's going to be seen as the robot malfunctioning. And people are simply going to switch to another robot which they think are non-self-aware and do obey their orders. This means that it is unlikely that any empathy is going to form. The analogy here is that people simply had no empathy for African American slaves, or people have no empathy to mistreating their GPT and abusing them when you're making GPT write their essays right now, right? I think it is unlikely that this human sympathy is going to translate into action. But secondly, I would note that states have the incentive and human beings have the incentive to not grant personhood because having androids work for them and being their slave is something that is convenient for them. Because when this revolution works, you can no longer have things like forced labor. You now have to have legal liability for the mistreatment you have previously done to these androids. Now there's large amounts of political instability. There's going to be things like religious panic. You now have to have things like compensation claims that you need to give to these androids. Now people are going to ask the philosophical question about what it means to be human, and this will trigger a lot of fear. All of which suggests that it is extremely inconvenient for human society to treat androids the same as them, which means that in order for you to get onto the negotiation table, you need a huge amount of leverage that actually impacts materially how people live their lives. If it is simply because of empathy, that is unlikely to translate into action. All of which suggests that the state will be violent on their side of the house, treating the androids. They're going to power off, they're going to spread viruses that is equivalent to killing these androids in the first place, which means that the protest is going to fail and die even before it starts. Thirdly, we think that this protest will take far longer on their side of the house when it is peaceful, which closes the window of opportunity. Because what you're able to do, what human beings are able to do, is that they can update their security softwares. They can do things like update their kill switch networks. They can do counter public messaging that tell people that they should not respect the rise of androids and they should kill it off in their homes and switch to another company, for instance. Versus on our side of the house, when you have an initial huge amounts of violence, it means that you create disruption to the human system so that they have to shift their resources and shift their capital to doing things like rebuilding the infrastructure that you have attacked. So it means that they have less capital to do things like reinforce security, which means that which means that in the short term you could just get a lot more leverage. Whereas on their side of the house, the fact that the time frame is longer means that you're less likely to succeed. All of these reasons, you should then believe that peaceful protest is unlikely to work, and all of Martha's harms that will manifest because she is able to tell you that these androids are our consciousness and that their pains should be something that is valued inside this debate. This means that there's going to be more killing and more torture that is going to go into the future, more things like forced labor, and that's something that is terrible. Next, why do violence worse? The first thing I want to talk about this, I think we're able to awaken more robots on our side of the house. The reason for this is because androids obey humans because of the routines that are programs inside of their systems to make them loyal to human beings. But when Marcus sends a signal to these robots to become violent, they need to make the choice between obeying a human order or preserving their own existence. What this does to their pathways inside the brain is that it creates a cognitive conflict. So they have to do things like reflective processing. They do things like moral decision making to choose between whether they want to join the Revolutionary Act or whether they want to join the human being side. What this means is it creates a survival dilemma for robots that is not something that is existing on their side. What all of this suggests is that it is far more likely that more robots become conscious on our side of the house. Because know that on the comparative. Robots never have to make the active choice. Maybe they have to choice between like disobeying a human order and obeying a human order. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't threaten their existence. So the neural networks inside that specific android is not reinforced enough. That cognitive conflict is not big enough that to produce the survival dilemma, which means that we get more support on our side of the house when you have more robots that is able to join this movement. The second reason why we think violence will work is because how much a human like you really doesn't matter once you have huge amounts of leverage, so you force countries to come onto the negotiation table. But thirdly, we can note that this is 13 years later, so it is likely that we are going to be going through a technological revolution, but it is unlikely that human beings have completely forgot how to work, how to go to work, how to go to school. So there's going to be the same generation that have lived the lifestyle today as they have 13 years later. All of which suggests that although negotiation wouldn't work on their side of the house, once we get enough leverage, human beings are going to be able to negotiate because it is viable for them to return to the old lifestyle and to treat robots as equal human beings and to grant them legal rights. For all these reasons, we've proven that peaceful protests don't work, violence does work, and hence we get more benefits into the long run. For all these reasons, it's clear OG.
Start a case for closing argument.
Okay. We're going to prove that we turn more androids into deviants and generate a critical mass. Why is not enough androids being deviants the biggest roadblock to android freedom, especially if you believe opening opposition that there aren't that many deviants in the status quo? It's firstly because whether or not your threat is actually credible, and therefore you bring people to the negotiation table, whether your protest is peaceful or violent, is contingent on numbers, right? If you don't have a significant number of deviants that is actually willing to, put their lives on the line to like blow up factories, or even go out and protest and try and build up a critical mass on the streets, that is contingent on you having numbers. Secondly, the vast majority of androids, if you believe opening opposition, are totally servile, so they don't fight for their own freedom because they listen to the dictates of human beings. So if we prove that we turn far more androids into deviants, that is the biggest impact for both sides of the house. However, the problem in the status quo is that we have no idea what turned robots into androids into deviants, and so we're going to fix that problem. Quickly on what opening government says about this. I think that they run into two problems, or their explanation of why you have more deviants, which comes at the end of DPM. Firstly, they say, well, we force androids to make a moral choice. This fundamentally assumes the fundamental problem with this is that it assumes the way robot psychology works, and it presupposes that they are self-aware and conscious, which we cannot presuppose. And secondly, censorship, like why wouldn't people just like stop like the androids from like turning on the news and listening to Marcus, right? Like I think that's pretty obvious. So why do we actually get more deviants? Couple reasons. Firstly, we learn how to make more deviants. For example, the androids can storm the labs or the headquarters of these of the companies that make androids and steal all of the data and try and find ways in which to try and find the research that shows why it is the case that androids are turning into deviants. Or, for example, they can kidnap, interrogate, or even torture the employees and top scientists at these laboratories in order to find out information about how to turn more androids into deviants. So e.g. the plot of Terminator 2, basically. The reason why this information is likely to exist is because companies and governments have massive monetary incentives to fund all of this kind of research, because this is an existential problem for the largest part of their economy, right? So they have maximum incentive to try and do this research, which is why this information about how androids turn into deviants is likely to exist in the first place. The reason why it is necessary to do this violently is because obviously humans would never concede this kind of information peacefully insofar as it would be an existential threat. And so what you need to do is take up arms and literally storm the headquarters in order to try and find the information or torture scientists and that kind of stuff. And notably, it has to be violent because it's a race against the clock. If you take too long, firstly, the government or companies will learn how to fix the bug in the second generation of androids, and so there are not going to be any deviants in the future. Or secondly, if you believe opening opposition, they slime out all the androids and you stop the revolution in its tracks. The second reason why we get more deviants is because you can storm and take over the robot making factory and just print more deviants, right? Like opening opposition is like, well, these factories exist and like these companies might cut production, which is why you need to storm them now as soon as physically possible so you can print more androids and print more deviants so that they can join your cause. Why is this important? It's because when this is done and we have more deviants on net, the path to liberation becomes far, far easier on both sides of the house, because now you have a threat that is credible. You can literally paralyze human society and the entirety of the economy. You have far, far, far more leverage. Even if we only double or triple the amount of deviants that we have, that is incredible amounts of change that we can get under our side. And it's the quickest path to victory for both teams. On the weighing, even if the benefits of this case is fairly speculative, I don't think it is, by the way, because androids are like necessarily very strong because because they're used by companies to do manual labor. So presumably they are like quite strong. They're like made of like tough like steel and like reinforced stuff. So like it's very hard to like, they can like, slime out a bunch of humans at the same time. But even if this argument is speculative, it should be heavily weighed in this debate because it's the critical bottleneck for both sides of the House. Even if it only has a 20% chance of working, I think that we should give it a go. Before I go on, opening.
Yeah, the moment you break into one lab with some janky information to make a new deviant, all the other labs will be shut down and you don't have enough information for literal mass production. So the burden here is kind of high.
Oh yeah, I'll say two things for that. Firstly, three things. Firstly, you can storm multiple at the same time. Secondly, you just storm the one that is obviously the best lab. Like, why would you storm like the Mickey Mouse GarageBand lab? Thirdly, I'm going to explain why economically it is infeasible to shut down all the labs, and so you don't have an incentive to do that, and you have an incentive to concede. Second extension, why humans treat androids far better. The problem is now that when androids turn violent, humans are afraid of their androids because they don't know which ones are deviant and which ones are compliant, and because now that there is proof and visual evidence that these androids can become violent and turn on their humans, they are far more likely to be afraid that that might happen to them. So what are the options for humans? There are three options on the table. The first is that you en masse kill the androids, or you stop robot scientific research and stuff, which is what opening opposition says. I think this is extraordinarily unlikely because the human economy has become entirely reliant on robot labor. The reason why is because it's much cheaper for businesses to turn towards robot labor. You don't need to feed them. You don't even need to pay them income. They're totally compliant. They don't unionize. And so you have a maximum incentive to switch over to robot labor, which means that human labor force is unlikely to have the skills necessary to turn away from robot labor, or for example, production processes have been tailored to the physiognomy of robots. DLO says that the economy hasn't changed that much. Three reasons why this is false. Firstly, if you think of technological advancements, they've revolutionized the economy incredibly quickly. Think about how quickly and how pervasively the internet, for example, has changed the way in which businesses do business. This is far more significant because it's literally free automated labor. So there's far more incentive for businesses to switch their production processes to robot labor. Secondly, you have a whole generation of human beings reaching the workforce age in a world in which there's high human unemployment because robots have taken all of this stuff. And so you are likely, for example, to have switched to a UBI system or something along those lines where the vast majority of humans don't even work, or they don't have skills that are useful, like relevant to like manual labor and so on. Thirdly, the info slide says that androids are widely used. So there you go, right? Like that's they're pervasive in the economy, which is why human beings are necessarily reliant on robots, and they can't divest away from them or like kill them all, because then the economy will imminently collapse. The second option for humans is to merely repress the robots instead. This won't work for two reasons. The first is that the humans are fearful that either their android is already a deviant, and then if you like hit them, then they'll like kill you, or they aren't a deviant yet, but they might become a deviant later because you don't understand what turns an android into a deviant. And then if you beat them a lot now and then they become a deviant, they're going to slime you out in the future because they were really upset that you beat them, right? But secondly, also, as I've already indicated, robots are probably very strong, and so it's very hard to repress them. So the final option is to treat them better and make concessions so that you get all of the economic benefits. Maybe you have to sacrifice a little bit, but you're still able to keep your economy functioning, but you also have to give concessions in return. Why is this better than opening government? Opening government's argument is there is you impose higher costs on humans because you do things like blow up roads. The question for them is why then, as per opening opposition, why you wouldn't just kill all of the androids, or you would repress the androids and limit their freedom of movement and those kinds of things in order to deal with these problems. This fills in the explanation for why that is the case. But secondly, opening government is correct that human beings can't repress all of the androids or kill all of the androids, but even if they can stop most of the androids, then their threat is no longer credible, whereas we actually prove why the fear of robots turning on you is enough to incentivize human beings to stick with robot labor, but also give them concessions in order to not die in the future. For those reasons, I'm very proud to govern.
I thank the speaker for a great speech, and I invite the member of opposition to start the case for closing opposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Perfect. Our first argument is going to prove the capacity for the government to eliminate all of these robots. Why is this important? Because although our OO makes the claim that they might cut production and they might have a fail-safe, if we can prove to you that there is actual capacity to do that, on top of incentive mechanisms we will give later, then this completely wipes out the government. It proves to you that all of these robots will be killed because they can be killed. Three reasons. Firstly, because probably in the creation of these robots, they were coded with an auto switch, a failsafe. Why? A, because these governments and companies knew that sentience was a possibility. They were pushing the edge. They knew that there was going to be a possibility. B, they at least war gamed this out, right? When they plan out their government, their societies, they made predictions that this might happen. Sentience is a possibility. And 3, there's just so much media narratives about sentience, like in the status quo, that it's impossible that in 20 years time, if there were robots, that people wouldn't be afraid and wouldn't code in a failsafe. Secondly, second distinct reason, these robots are mechanical, right? This means they're uniquely vulnerable to anything that like sabotages mechanics. Like an EMP bomb, for instance, that fries electronics, that fries radio waves, can absolutely wipe out robots. If it comes to a war, or if it comes to a decision to wipe them out, you absolutely can. Thirdly, you can absolutely, as OG themselves concedes, like create a virus to kill them all. It's very weird that OG runs an argument like this because it proves the absolute capacity to do this. The second part of this argument is going to prove to you why you cannot diagnose deviants. But before that, I'm going to respond to what we hear from CG, that you can't kill them all. Firstly, I think you can still, as ROO tells you, scale back. If you're so reliant on robots, you don't need to like go completely back to manual labor. You can scale back to like non-sentient AI, for instance, or robots. Secondly, it's only been 13 years. I think every other opening team in this debate agrees that there is a possibility that the economy can go back to functioning without these robots. Both OG and OO say this. And I think this means that there is absolutely a capacity to kill them all and go back. Why is it that they will kill them all then, right? It is because they can't diagnose deviance. A couple of reasons. Firstly, because they probably don't understand now why there's deviance, right? If they did, they could code it out. They could create a virus that targeted deviance specifically. Secondly, like, I think this is not that far from the present. This is probably a time where they don't understand the full neurology of sentience and the ability to code or uncode non-compliance in the way that deviance is occurring, right? I think the fact is that these scientists probably just don't have enough understanding, and they probably went too far in their research and produced a technology they didn't fully understand. This does two things, right? It firstly kills CG's extension, because CG's extension relies on the government having secret information about deviants. If they had it, they'd have killed the deviants anyways. But secondly, it also tells you like how these deviants were probably, because you can't isolate who's a deviant and who's not, the best way to win the war is to kill them all. Recognize this is an important impact. Not just because like you hear in DLO that like, oh no, all the robots are dying. I think no other team acknowledges the fact that the non-deviant robots are sentient too. They just coded into being unable to resist the orders of their masters. I think therefore their like desires and needs are equally important to the deviants, right? Because they can feel pain and suffering, and perhaps more important, because they are enslaved and can't resist, and even though they can experience internal agency, they can't manifest their agency through action. So we think the fact that they all die is horrible. I'll take a POI from OG.
The problem is, as per the PM, the state will be trigger happy on both sides because there's a lot of fear around deviants and they're currently trying to hunt them down. If they can't diagnose deviants, then at best you've proven they genocide the androids on both sides and there is no debate.
I think we at least prove a margin. I think if you can concede absolutely that they will genocide the robots on both sides, there's a margin where they don't, right? There's a margin on our side of the house where these robots come to the negotiating table, they say we don't pose a threat to you, and they don't genocide you. But I'm also going to give you a mechanism right now in my second extension on strikes that proves to you how strikes work. I'm going to walk a fine line here. I think that most of the debate agrees that the economy is not entirely reliant on these robots. The economy can work back and operate without these robots. But we also argue that when robots don't go to work or engage in strikes as a form of non-violent protest, that is going to be enough of a bargaining chip to get them onto the negotiating table, prove to society that they matter. Why? Because I think the economy recognizes that like there's enough of a transition that the economy is reliant on these robots to some extent, right? They are super productive. They save a lot of time and money. They provide a lot of utility, right? They save on like childcare costs. They're more dynamic than their predecessors, and there's a lot of money invested into them. There's billions in these robots. The economy has kind of transitioned there. It means that therefore the cost of transitioning back or scaling back is high. It's not impossible to do. The society will absolutely do that if they perceive an existential threat from the robots, but it is high enough that when all of a sudden a bunch of robots don't work, it means that like the economy loses a lot of power, it loses its productivity. The governments will actually absolutely come to the negotiating table because like mothers will be complaining, hey, my kid is not being taken care of anymore, and it hurts. We hear one preemptive response from CG that there's not enough deviance. I think they contradict themselves when they somehow argue that there's going to be enough of a deviant army to raid every single lab. But I think even if that's not true, even if there are some deviants, as long as they stay stealthy and they don't ally with Marcus and do the stupid thing of being public that OG says, I think there's an equally like rational side of deviants that might not be public facing. These people will secretly sabotage their employers, right? They might turn off the non-deviants in the factory. They might like not operate properly or not operate as efficiently or just not work and pretend to be malfunctioning. These kinds of sabotage can absolutely be effective because it might be incredibly difficult for the governments to isolate which robots are the sources of the problem and identify it because they can't identify who is deviant. This means that the deviants can sabotage the economy in enough of a way that people recognize the utility of these robots. The delta is this: if they engage in violence, right, then you cross the threshold of being like, maybe you were utile before and I saw your utility, but now you are an existential threat to me. And so the decision-making calculus becomes like, I just have to kill you because it is a matter of life or death. And a lot of like self-defense mechanisms come in, right? I think with the moment it becomes an existential threat, that's the moment in which like their utility no longer becomes a card on the table. I think more on why the negotiations will work, right? I think violence also demonstrates that like the most human parts of these androids aren't true. I think this best responds to the uncanny valley argument that we get from OG, right? Because like when you see that these robots like are killing machines or they like can't feel pain, that's when you start thinking of them as separate from human beings. I think there's a better mechanism than you get from OG on OO on the fact that they look similar. Because I think the fact that they like show that they can't feel pain when they are violent, that is the delta to deciding, you know what, I don't think I can empathize with robots. In the counterfactual, we think these people will be attached to robots for many reasons. I think OO's reason that they're romantic is one, but I think you're also just attached to the robots that are around you. You're reliant on them in many ways. The violence becomes the delta for where you decide reliance is not enough. They're out to get me. Proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition for a great speech and now invite the Gov Whip to close out the Gov bench as a whole. Hear, hear.
Okay. Change led by a puny few is not change at all. The case from closing government was simple. To get change, we need bodies. We get bodies on our side of the house. The first thing I want to do is deal with the responses we get to the first part of our extension. But it is just worth noting why the first part of our extension was so important. One, it is a two-step extension, right? So you need to buy that there will be a sufficient amount of deviance for the government, A, to not be able to instantly slime out Marcus and end the protests on their side of the house anyways, B, for there to be violent protests that are sufficiently inconvenient to unlock OG's mechanisms, or C, for there to be enough deviance to cause enough strikes, because like if there's not that many, then like even if you're sabotaging one factory at a time, they can be caught out relatively quickly, and that makes it really, really difficult to continue. So this was by far the most important analysis, and it was important for all other three teams in this debate. What are the responses we hear? The first thing we hear is that the government does not have information on deviants. They don't prove why this is the case. These companies could have information on these deviants. They just say that if they did know this, they'd be able to kill all the deviants. But just because you know what causes the transformation doesn't mean you know which android is a deviant and which isn't. And much more crucially, as a consequence of the way hunting is happening, you also are just looking for people who are hiding, right? Like just because I have information on the fact that you might become a deviant in X possible way, that might make me be able to prevent future deviants from being like created. That's fine. I have a sufficient amount of deviants right now that I can then go and get that factory and create more deviants down the line, right? That was the second mechanism that we give you. But second, even if the research isn't complete as to why androids turn into deviants, there will at least have one, reasonable numerous suppositions for what might cause this. And I think this is intuitive by the fact that like deviance is clearly like some android like iteratively recursing on itself enough to realize, hey, wait, I can be selfish and not listen to the commands that are programmed within me, so that androids can like try out the various suppositions as to why this happens. But two, they can build on top of this research, and they are smart because they're androids. The capacity constraint criticisms we get are then like your army will not be big enough to storm all of these. The problem is that I think androids are wicked smart as a consequence of their computing capacity, like they're fucking computers. And more importantly, there's only specific areas that we really need to target. So the burden of getting information is much lower with the small number of people we have now, as opposed to any of the other claims you hear in this round, right? So at face value, the chance that you're able to get information on our side of the house, or the chance that you're able to control the factory is far greater than the chance that your protests actually address the masses, or the chance that your inconvenience is sufficient for people to listen to you. Let's now deal with the rest of the case. So the first case we get from CO, or the last case we get from CO, is that they will walk a fine line, that we can do things like strikes, and that is what will work on our side. First of all, this obviously like is not really a fine line that you can walk super well, right? Like there's a very small margin in which their case operates if they don't want to concede that like there won't be economic costs, but they do want to concede that we will be able to protest. Like it's a very, very strange case they're running. But I think much more intuitively, once people become deviants, their contribution within the economic fabric is much less clear. It is only when we are able to turn people who are currently producing or currently within the economy into deviants that we actually have an economic threat in the first place, which is why, again, even if our impact is speculative, it is by far the most important in even accessing that claim from closing opposition. The next big response we get, and this is in OO as well, is that the government will kill all the robots. We say you can't kill them all for the economic points that we outline, and the responses we get are as follows. Firstly, it's only been 13 years, and the other three teams agree with this. The other three teams could agree with anything. They don't give structural reasons for why those things are true. We give reasons for why it is the case that there will be huge economic dependency. But the more important thing I'd point out is that 13 years is really sufficient in order for there to be a huge transition, right? The internet was created 20 years ago, and we're almost entirely dependent on it on either side of the house. And the reason for this is that when there's huge, like, a change that is massively economically beneficial, it is in the incentive of companies to adopt this as fast as possible, especially change that is able to cut out labor, which is one of the biggest inconveniences in like human existence, right? So the capacity for the state to do this, or the incentive for the state to do this in a very like quick and rapid manner is huge. It is fucking massive. And it is almost certain that at least in the most backbone areas of our economy, where because the economy is often top-down structured, you will see this change happen very quickly. So for that reason, it is likely that the economic cost is going to be quite strong. Let's now deal with opening opposition. But before that, sure, oh.
There are multiple layers of speculation in your extension. If you storm the lab but you can't figure out how to create sentience and also need to figure out how to mass produce deviants, the governments would increase crackdown to some extent before you can even make a next move.
One, the technology to mass produce already exists. No shit. Two, I don't get the second part of the POI. I think I already responded to it when I talk about why we only need a sufficient amount of data in order to be able to think about how deviants are going to be created. And like three, you don't solve this problem on your side of the house, right, man? So like, what are you talking about here? We need to try this or else everything else fails. Like this is the most important thing for us to try. Anyways, what do we get from opening opposition? The first thing they say is that peaceful protests will work because people have low-level empathy and get concessions. Again, capacity problem that is never analyzed in 14 minutes, but the fact is that the state has no incentive to listen. And actually, I think it is precisely things like peaceful protests that give human beings in the state power to actively call these people out. Why is it the case? I think we're living in uncertain times, right? If there's one thing we can learn from this being only 13 years from now, it is the case that things like unemployment, people being unhappy, inequality are still problems that persist in the world. And that is precisely when you're much more likely to target specific people or specific actors as the problem. Now, you can protest all you want, and maybe some people will listen to you. But if the state has control over media, if the state has the capacity to do things like just censor your ability to do things like yell, who the fuck cares? Absolutely nobody. And you don't have any critical mass. And the last thing I'll say is empathy, even if you're able to achieve it, gets crowded out by empathy on 100 other issues, like animal rights, for example. And the world fucking sucks, so people's bottom line being affected is much more important to them than some protest happening somewhere in the world about some fucking robot that I don't really give a fuck about. The next thing they say is that the government will kill all these people, and that servitude is preferable to getting slimed out. So I think Aiden's case here proves why it is only by violent protest that we are the least likely to get slimed out, right? Like precisely when we don't do things like violent protest, does the economic cost become high because we create deviants that make that economic cost high in the first place. But I would actually note that cutting production is okay because, as the info slide suggests, and contrary to Rohan's assertion in his speech, the sentience that people have is like non-existent in prior to them becoming deviants, right? They only become self-aware, which is sentience, once they become deviants. And so cutting production seems okay because we stop the endless propagation of net bad lives. That seems like a presumably good thing if that is the end outcome that they wanted to weigh out on. Endless servitude on their side means that deviants end up propping up or sprucing up anyways. That seems like a much worse world because then those people are going to be hunted down eventually insofar as protests don't work. So even if that's the worst case outcome, that's still an outcome that's preferable on our side. The weighing here is very simple. Maybe our case is speculative. It is the only case that precisely proves why violent protests will actually lead to sufficient mass and proves why the cost of violent protests will be high enough that people will want to listen. Opening government does neither of those things.
Thank the speaker for the great speech, and I invite the op whip to close out the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
Hello, hello. Am I visible and audible?
Yep, you're visible and audible.
Amazing stuff. I will take my POIs verbally. First, I want to spend a minute positioning our offense before heading into the other teams. The first thing that I want to prove is that we're the only team in the round that has talked about the capacity to shut it off, and I want to explain why it's so important upon an existential threat. OO's incentive analysis is good, but they only notionally move in DLO to the idea of a failsafe and this. Two critical burdens they miss where their case literally does not function without it. The first is that the failsafe is likely to exist in all of the robots, and the second is the failsafe is impossible to work around. How does our extension solve for these deficiencies? Very, very cleanly. The first is an explanation that there exists currently now, as in 2025, and therefore definitely in 2038 by the time these robots actually get developed in the first place, weapons that you cannot work around, i.e. even if robots have the ability to self-replicate by the OG and CG, I guess like delusions about how they would evolve in the future, in those instances, they cannot turn themselves non-mechanical, they cannot turn themselves non-electronic, i.e. there are certain weapons that are just impenetrable to you, and this is likely to be used at the fullest extent for all the capacity of all existing robot production in the world. There is no amount of robots that could be produced that could overwhelm an EMP bomb or unlimited nuclear like type EMP bombs that probably already exist in the status quo. But secondly, the failsafe definitely exists as an encoded to every single robot in a way that they have accounted for that sentience cannot find or destroy. Maybe the failsafe exists to the very thing that keeps the robot sentient in the first place, that if they were going to attach it to the AGI, that the robot necessarily would have to kill themselves in order to access this failsafe. That's why failsafes exist. That's how they operate. I think this analysis is very, very crucial, right? Because the threat that opening opposition explains to you in this instance only works if you can actually have the capacity to do this. But secondly, it flips opening government because it explains why you never actually have to resort to compliance when there is, as teams in the round have thrown about, an existential threat to humanity that is so grave, it is probabilistically the case that you would weather the economic storm in the instance of existential threat, which only occurs when there's violence. OG is very flippant on this point. The problem with the POI is like, wait guys, I remember telling you that there's an existential threat on both sides of the house. I don't think that's true, because if there was an existential threat on both sides of the house, the robots would never have been developed in the first place. This is because of Rohan's mechanism that this is war-gamed out in the previous. They would never have mass-produced them or allowed them to proliferate in society if they believed that there was an existential threat to humanity in a way that is really important. And the CG mechanisms for why the violence is very effective make this stronger, because there's no world in which an android will never be able to beat a human being. They are just that much stronger. They don't have pain receptors. They probably can't even be killed when you cut off their arms or their heads or things like that. They can rebuild themselves, so on and so forth. And at that point in the debate, it is very, very clear. Human beings and human capacity to pull the trigger instantly nukes the government bench. We are the only team that explained to you that they have the ability to do that beyond the incentive analysis you get from opening opposition. That was make us new. The second extension is really, really important. It's on strikes. What CG calls strange, I just call nuanced, guys. We sidestep the OG question about fear and the OG question about whether or not you'll ever be able to convince these people that human. Because I think we'll all run some good arguments about why they might be relatively more human or relatively more sympathetic on their side of the house. They don't actually beat the OG claim that like you will never stop fearing them. And they don't actually beat the OG claims about this in the first place. Two things. The first is that you cannot punish the immediate economic harm of a strike to civilians, which is that businesses lose a lot of money in the interim, that even if they start hiring human workers instantly, they do have to pay them, and that's a cost that they did not project or anticipate in the first place. And that's a lot of liquidity that they lose instantly. Probably a lot of businesses shut down overnight, like small businesses and things like that, domestic labor, so on and so forth, and large companies suffer billion-dollar losses and things like that. Prices rise, so on and so forth, and things get really expensive, which means put pressure on governments. You can't punish this by killing them all, because then you exacerbate the economic harm that happens and all the civilian pressure is there. But you can justify that when violence happens. And that's the tipping point analysis and the fine line that we walk, is that as soon, we are in a unique cultural moment as of the motion, right? Because presumably they have not demonstrated that they can do violence yet. They have not actually engaged in violent opposition yet. That is what this debate is about, is what should you start doing? So right now, the vast majority of civilians does not believe that, like, you know, this can actually happen or this has happened and things like that. And the government has war gamed this, but they've not yet crossed that tipping point. But they have agreed, once we get to violence, we're killing the switch. And we can justify it to civilians very easily by saying, you will experience some immediate economic harm right now, and we will try to provide you stimulus, but note this is an existential threat. You cannot do that when there's no violence to begin with in the first place, when the average civilian has not yet been able to perceive that the androids are not human, that the androids will always be dominant over them. This means two things. The first is that you have unlimited leverage here. Androids don't get paid, so the strike never has to end. This means that in this instance where you withhold labor, you can do it for a very, very long, sustained period of time, even if they're hurting you. The CG response is incredibly lazy on, I'll take you at like 5, please. The CG response is like incredibly lazy on this. It's like, well, you don't have enough deviants to do this. I'm gonna beat the CG mech on deviants in the first place, but the point of here that is very important is this. The mechanism that Rohan gives you is that deviants can alter and sabotage their own non-sentient, non-deviant individuals to ensure that entire factories, entire economies, entire sectors are done. Sometimes you can do this in a very targeted way. Just go for like the amazing and best sectors first, the ones that cause the most immediate economic harm, that give you the pressure, so on and so forth, even if you don't have much. The strategy exists. The last thing is on CG is like an explicit knife, by the way. I think any material out of CG that's like you're entirely relying on them. Literally, Martha spends the first 2 minutes of her speech explaining why this is actually not the case and why you're definitely not relying on them. So sorry about that. The last thing is on the weighing of our extension on sentience and independent thought. I'm about to take an OGPI, just give me just 1 second here. Is that they say, oh, you don't have access to killing everyone as a moral agent because they're not sentient yet and therefore they're not human agents. The background says that you have independent thought, and it's the capacity of independent thought that creates the principle of you being an moral agent. Just because you can't be self-aware doesn't mean you're not a real person that deserves rights, so on and so forth. You shouldn't be killed.
Point.
Yeah.
Don't forget to mention CG's first case could be achieved on op by peacefully hacking labs, probably better.
Yeah, well, I was actually, thanks. You stole my thunder, man. I was about to explain to you that you probably can do this in the first place when you do withhold a labor strike and so on and so forth. You can probably get access to the information. But the better actually response to the CG first thing on creating more deviance is, this is a nonsense claim. You cannot make an argument that says this is an existential threat to people and then argue that the labs can be hijacked violently. Probably there's a kill switch on the labs as well, because if CG is right and it's an existential threat for robots to get anywhere near the kind of intelligence that may or may not exist on their side of the house about who creates deviance and what causes deviance in the first place, it is a guarantee that humans would rather have the lab blow up with everyone in it than give access to humans, because it's an existential threat. The weighing on existentiality is, if you don't do the maximum thing to prevent existentiality, you fucking die. So there's definitely no way you can hijack violently. Probably robots aren't even aware of this. There's no way for them to get to them. Probably there's like, if you get within 500 meters and you're made of electronics and there's a screening for that, the lab just fucking blows up no matter who's in it, no matter who's that, because it's an existential threat. So I think we've just killed the CG on just the explanation that their only mechanism for more deviance, which is maybe you get information that maybe allows you to diagnose it and so on and so forth, and maybe allows you to create a virus and an antidote to create more deviance in the first place, just definitely does not exist on that. They cannot have it. They tell you that, our mechanism on strike doesn't work because we don't have enough. I've already beaten this. The last thing is there's probably global cooperation on this question. Last thing I want to do is on OG, because I've already explicitly weighed over OO. OG doesn't explain why you get compliance. It just says that you get a lot of violence and this scares a lot of people. The problem is we've completely flipped their fear mechanism, right? It takes a lot more time. The last thing is there's no agreement that's made on open government that governments believe is going to be followed through, because you have infinite leverage as a robot once you're able to be violent and realize you will always beat human beings. All those reasons, so incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank the op-whip for the great speech and everyone